we've spent a lot of time on the cell, and we've looked at the cell in general. We've looked at the nucleus, we've looked at the nucleolus, we've looked at DNA, we've seen transcription and translation, we've looked at ribosomes, we've looked at all kinds of organelles that have all kinds of functions, and we've also looked at this idea of the cell membrane. We looked at its composition. We've looked at the idea of having uh, an opening in that membrane that allows certain things through and not others. That semi-permeable concept. We've looked at diffusion, and we've seen how things move from high to low, and that this movement is due to this random randomness, and how it depends on the concentration of the material on one side versus the concentration of material on the other. So a question that becomes important is how do this how do these processes work? What fuels these processes? What allows for movement? And hopefully you remember from middle school that it's kinetic energy, right? And that was one of the things that drove diffusion and even osmosis, is this concept of kinetic energy. And kinetic energy is just the energy of movement, 1/2 mv squared. So where v is velocity and m is mass, right? So hopefully you remember that from middle school. But if you didn't, well, this is new to you. And so there's this idea that things are constantly moving. And however, we don't want things to move randomly if we're going to be talking about life. If you're going to be talking about organizing a human being or a tree or a whale or even a cell, you want this energy to be focused and organized. And we need to be able to take energy from different one form and transform it. The word is transform it. Transform it into something different, right? So, what's a good example of this energy transformation? Well, one of those transformations occurs every time you drive a car. So, when you're driving a car down the road, you you're taking gasoline, right? And you're burning it in the engine, or your dad is, your mom. You're burning in the engine, you're driving down the road, happy as you can be. Gasoline is gases are escaping out. So let's think about that. We have gases. That's carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, right, coming out of there. Into the tank, into the engine is going fuel, gasoline, and you're burning it. And so and burning means you're adding oxygen gas to it, and it's releasing the energy in the chemical bonds, and that's pushing pistons and turning wheels, and away you go down the road. That's an energy transformation, and that energy transformation was taking gasoline, a chemical form of energy, and changing it, transforming it. The word transforming it into heat and mechanical energy. Right? You would agree it's moving down the road, changing gears, turning wheels, that's mechanical. So we go from this idea of gasoline, it's just a liquid that you pour into your gas tank. You ignite it with a little spark, and let's not forget that spark, and it starts the burning inside a cylinder that turns all the things that you need to turn to move down the road. And so this is an example of transformation of energy. Well, the source of all this energy, and yes, and we'll talk about that. I was going to mention fossils. The source of this energy is fossil fuels, and that's why they're fossils actually. So that's why we call it fossil fuels. But initially, that source of the energy came from the sun. So I shouldn't say all, most of the energy that we use in life comes from the sun. And so the sun is shooting out these wavelengths, right? We call them wavelengths. These waves, these little quanta, and they're known as photons, little packets of energy. But how do we turn this photon, this light from the sun, after it travels millions of miles, how do we turn that energy into a chemical form of energy that we can use in a cell that we've been talking about all this time, proteins and sugars and fats? How do we do that? Well, we don't do that, but there is this thing called a leaf. And it's not just leaves, obviously. It's all kinds of photosynthetic organisms can do this. Photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis, the making of something using what? Using light, okay? And the leaves are our prime example, but it's any photosynthetic organism, so any organism that uses photosynthesis. And that includes, some forms of bacteria, single-celled organisms. We've talked about cyanobacteria, and of course plants, which is the one of the most important for us as animals that we discuss, plants and leaves in general. So in some way, this light from the sun hits a leaf, and this leaf is able to turn that energy, that sun's energy, into something that we can eat and we can use to talk and to move and to do all the things that a cell does. So how does that happen? How do you transform that light energy from light into sugar? Well, that's what we're going to study. That's what photosynthesis is. We're going to look at that and we're going to think about it. All right. So the overall chemical reaction we're talking about photosynthesis is we're going to take carbon dioxide, or we're not going to take it. The plants are going to take carbon dioxide, and we're going to add to it water, carbon dioxide and water, and we're going to produce, in the presence of light, because that's where the energy is coming from, is light, and we're going to produce C6H12O6 plus some extra oxygen gas. So that's what's going to happen. We're going to take this material and we're going to make, we're going to produce this sugar that we eat every day, that people eat, like they're eating their cereal and drink it. So that's the basic formula for photosynthesis. CO2 plus water in the presence of light gets you C6H12O6 plus oxygen gas. But it's not one chemical reaction. And that's kind of the problem with trying to oversimplify things. This makes you think that it's just one step, that light hits the leaf, there's this chemical reaction that happens, and then you get it. Well, there's actually a lot of details involved. There's a whole system, actually 3 or 4 systems and 2 major cycles that are involved in photosynthesis. And so let's delve into that a little bit. And I'm just going to try to give you the basics. The details are in your chapter. and you'll have to find a lot. You'll get a lot of the answers for your your guided reading, your guided study from this video, and we'll continue our discussion and our delving into how all this works on Monday. Remember, tomorrow we have a field trip. So, in any case, when we're talking about CO2 plus water and making sugar, you're going to have the light is going to have to do something. One of the interesting things about light is that electrons can absorb the photon, and then they go up in energy. So if this is the electron's initial energy, all right, let's call it initial energy. With a photon, if a light beam comes in, a photon can come in, a light wave can come in, right? And it can be absorbed by the electron. The electron can actually take it in, and that energy, it starts to vibrate, and that photon can then increase its energy level. So if it had an energy level here, initial energy level, it could actually increase to a much higher energy level. All right. And so it turns out that biological systems can take advantage of that phenomenon. The idea that this electron can get higher energy, can increase the amount of energy it has, can drive different molecules and atoms to move around inside various systems. And we're going to talk about these photosystems, all right, in just a minute. But that's a phenomenon you have to kind of get to understand. And you don't have to understand it completely. Just know that that electrons can absorb light, and they can increase in the amount of energy they have. And just like you can touch a warm stove and warm yourself, energy can be transferred, not just transformed, but also transferred from one system to the next. So in any case, the energy can come in, and if you have water, and this is how water is used in photosynthesis, water, H2O, there's hydrogen and 2 oxygens. The electrons in water, using various chemical processes we're not going to get into the details of. You have this photosystem 2. Can take in this photon, this light wave, right? And it can take in one photon. It can excite the electron and rip off the hydrogens. It can rip off the hydrogens, so these electrons then are lost, right? And what you're left with is H pluses, hydrogen ions, and you're left with an oxygen. Now you can bond two oxygen. What happens is the 2 oxygens come together and they form oxygen gas. And that's why photosynthesis releases oxygen gas. So in fact, in the very first step of photosynthesis, one of the first things that happens is that you produce oxygen. So if you're looking at and trying to find out why do plants release oxygen? Well, oxygen is produced in the very first step of photosynthesis. Electrons are excited, and the system continues to pass on that electron down almost a chain of carriers, exciting that electron and using the energy in that electron gathered from the photon. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. Let's look at this membrane, and this is a membrane inside the chloroplast called the thylakoid membrane, and we'll look at what those are in a little bit as far as bigger structure, macro structures. But right now, let's take a look at that photon, that light wave that's going in, exciting the electron, and the electrons then. That energy is used to split water. Water's split, just like we looked at down here. The electrons then move on up and get passed along. Electrons are literally taken off of water. And what you're left with is half an oxygen, right? Because in water you only have one oxygen and two hydrogens. But if you do two of these, you run two of these reactions, take two sets of electrons off of water, and you end up with two oxygens. That's how you get an oxygen gas molecule. This is O2. But you get half of oxygen and two hydrogens, so one half of oxygen gas, which is two oxygens, plus two hydrogens, right? So that's where this half equation comes from. And the electrons get passed along. How many electrons? Two, one for each hydrogen. See, they're hydrogen plus. Notice they're hydrogen ions. And the hydrogen ions stay on this side of the thylakoid membrane. That's going to be important for later. So I'm only going to go through half this reaction. I'm only going to show you what's happening with photosystem 1 and 2. I'm only showing you right now how we get light to go from energy into capture that into some kind of chemical form so that we can then use it to make sugar. And when I say we, I mean life, right? Because humans don't use it, plants do. So the electrons get passed along these carriers, and no, you don't need to know the carriers, but you should know it's called an electron transport chain. We're going to actually see an electron transport chain again in a mitochondria, but this is all in a chloroplast. So the first step is in the stroma, which is a space inside the chloroplast, and embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid membrane, you have these proteins that capture a photon because of, again, that excitement, that ability of electrons to absorb photons and then be excited to a higher energy state. That photon energy can be transferred over. The electrons can be removed from water. Those electrons with all that energy can be transferred from one molecule to the next in a chain. And that's why we call it an electron transport chain. So first step, capturing the photon, the energy from light. Second step, you excite the P680. You don't have to know the P680. Just know it's a second step is excite the electrons. Third step, you remove the electrons, jump off of water and off of the bond between. Remember, what are chemical bonds? They're sharing of electrons. So if you take the electrons away, what happens is the hydrogen is left without them, and that's why it has a plus charge. And the bond between oxygen and hydrogen are broken. So we literally break water up. That's what plants do. That's why they need water to do. That's why plants need water to break up to do photosynthesis. And so the electrons get transported from one carrier to the next. When they get over here, they've lost a lot of their energy. Now it's important that you understand that the making of these hydrogen ions, the production of these hydrogen ions is a big important part. But this oxygen here is unnecessary for photosynthesis. It is true, though, and this is a really important point. It is true that this oxygen is necessary for respiration, and plants do respiration as well. So this oxygen can be used by the plant to break down the sugar later if the plant needs to use that sugar for energy. Otherwise, that oxygen is then released out of the leaf and back into the air, which is why people say that plants take in carbon dioxide and use and put out oxygen. It's because the plants produce extra oxygen when they're doing this process, when they're capturing light and passing the electrons through and breaking up water. So as the electrons get transported down the electron transport chain, and again, you can see that the systems are very similar. This is called photosystem 2. Then this one is 1. So the first one is actually photosystem 2. The second one is photosystem 1. As the electrons then get re-excited, how are they excited again? Using that energy, that photon. But the energy is not used to break up water in this case. That energy is then those electrons with all that energy. Notice that as they get transported from one carrier to the other, what's happening here? The arrows, the orange arrows is showing you the energy. The energy is being released. It's being lost. So it's down. By the time it gets to photosystem 1, it's lost. The electrons have lost a lot of their energy. And so by absorbing a second photon, so one photon for photosystem 2 and a second photon for photosystem 1, the electrons are able to reignite, reabsorb that energy. Now they're high energy electrons again. And what this molecule is, this very interesting molecule, NADP, recombines with a hydrogen to form NADPH. And that NADPH, okay, NADPH transports those two high energy electrons, there they are, over to the second part of photosynthesis, where you're actually going to make the sugar. So electron transport chain provides the energy to make ATP, and we're going to look at that in a minute, because one of the other things you do is make ATP, and that's an important issue. That's what exactly is ATP. So there'll be a whole another little video on that, and you have some reading to do that describes exactly what ATP is. This is the ultimate goal, is to be able to have ATP to do the chemical processes that both plants and animals need to do. But of course, making sugar and storing that energy in a longer term form of chemical storage or energy storage, you want to put it in sugar. ATP is really good as currency, but you can think of sugar as almost like a bank, where you put your currency, right? So if ATP is your dollar bill, then sugar is your bank, where you're going to put that dollar bill away. So in any case, the NADP is the last electron acceptor in this chain, and it turns into NADPH. The electrons are in the NADPH. They're part of the bond. They have a lot of energy here, and that's going to go over to what's known as the Calvin cycle. So these were the photosystems, right? Photosystem 2 and 1, where the energy was captured. But all that energy, the ATP, the NADPH, all has to go to the Calvin cycle. And that's will be the next video, is looking at the Calvin cycle, how we make sugar. So now we've looked at how energy is captured. What's important for you to take home here? What are you going to be tested on the exam next Friday? What you're going to be tested on is where the source of the electrons. It's water. Why is water needed for photosynthesis? It's for the electrons and the hydrogen ions. There's a step here that I'm going to make a whole video all on its own. It's this electron transport chain and making ATP, because that's another reason why the photosystems happen, is to make this ATP. That's also important. The fact that you have two photosystems, photosystem 2 and 1, and that the last electron acceptor is NADP plus and forms NADPH. That this NADPH carries the electrons, called an electron carrier, takes these electrons to the Calvin cycle. So you have to know that the Calvin cycle is where sugar is going to be made. So what is all this? What was all this about? Capturing the energy from the sun and putting it in a chemical form, in this case NADPH and ATP, that can then be used to make sugar in the Calvin cycle. And the way we're going to make that sugar, well, we'll talk about it. Another thing you have to notice and look and remember, the whole reaction here was CO2, H2O, light makes sugar and oxygen, right? Well, here we've made the oxygen. There it is, right? Here we've used the water. There it's used, right? Here we've used light. There's the light, the photons. But notice that there's no CO2 anywhere in here yet, and we haven't made sugar yet. Both those steps, the sugar and the CO2, is going to be discussed in the Calvin cycle. So again, there'll be 2 more videos. I'll send them to you soon. Good luck in studying this stuff.